Lord, yes, papi, hit me one time and make it funky.
I was brought up and told to have no fear. I was brought up and told to have no fear. I was brought up and told to have no fear.
Welcome to the Full Circle Podcast. I'm one of your hosts, David Roberts, along with the OG, Dr. Neil Holmes, and the oral historian, Andre Taylor. Today, we have a very special guest. We went to the University of Akron together as an undergrads, I should say. He's gone on to obtain his PhD. He's also a licensed social worker with, I would guess, an African-centered community approach. Please welcome Dr. Curtis Williams. Dr. Williams, how you doing today, brother?
I'm doing well. Thank you.
You know, when I first saw, thank you for inviting me to like your Dr. Williams page on Facebook. And then when I first saw what you were doing with the Akron Library, a 4-part series on resiliency, I was so excited about getting you onto the program with us to talk with us this evening that I said, I'll register for the event later. So by the time I tried to register, it was closed. But I know it's a 4-part series, and by the time this airs, there'll still be 2 parts left, February 16th and the 23rd.
Yes.
We'll still be able to register for that. Okay, so why don't we go into, first, let's talk about, before we talk about what you're doing in your series, why don't we just talk about your career, how you moved after you graduated from the University of Akron?
Well, that was very interesting, right? I had an opportunity to play a little professional football. I played with Orlando, and that was very interesting because I think it was the first time I really recognized as an athlete that I was being exploited. I didn't know it in college, but when I played professionally, I thought to myself, wow, this is a lot like slavery, right?
Yeah.
And so I had a very short career. I only played 2 seasons, and I came back to the University of Akron. And I don't know if you all remember Virgil Starks. He was a dear friend of mine when I was an undergrad.
He passed on, unfortunately.
He did. He passed from Auburn University. And I sat down with Virgil and I talked to him about my experience of being exploited in the World Football League. And I also connected it to being exploited at the University of Akron. Brother Starks, he wrote some letters to the NCAA and proved my level of exploitation all the way down to my academic curriculum. And the NCAA ended up paying for not only the remainder part of my bachelor's degree, but also my master's degree.
Wow.
And after that, I went into social work for Catholic Charities, right? And Catholic Charities was a very interesting experience. It also had some racial connotations connected to it as well. And in that experience, I ended up coming to minority behavioral health, which wasn't minority behavioral health then. It was called the African American Counseling Team. And it had a total number of, it had 5 founders and 4 working individuals at that particular time. And at Minority Behavioral Health, I was the first full-time employee. And as we evolved as a small group of people, we began to desire to be more than just African Americans providing mental health services or counseling services. So we ended up doing a tremendous amount of research with Dr. John Queener, Dr. Tania Lodge, Dr. Pamela Fair, and we began to look into African-centered modalities, and we partnered with Linda Jane Myers from Ohio State, and we began to use her optimal belief system model. And before us, the model was primarily being used with individual practitioners, and we turned it into a community model. And we begin to bring individuals in for interns for their PhD, and it called for a level of retraining. Dr. Lodge wrote her dissertation on the training process. for individuals that have been trained in traditional therapeutic modalities and how they have to be retrained into the African-centered modality under the auspices that just because you are African-centered or African-American doesn't necessarily mean you're African-centered. And so now we have a tremendous number of African-American professionals that have walked through minority behavioral health. And Pastor Jeffrey Dennis, his dream was to train enough people that we could flood the community with individuals that are trained in the art of providing mental health services to individuals of African descent.
Okay.
And so for the past 20 years, I've been doing just that.
Okay. All right.
And Dr. Williams, the area that you're in, where are you at geographically?
We're in Akron, Ohio, believe it or not.
So I heard you say that the African Americans and you were the first full-time hire with that. How did they? What was their focus before you got there, and how did you change that focus to benefit the community you're in?
Well, when I first arrived there, again, each of the individuals that were already in the existing, we call them founders, right? They were all practicing a level of African-centeredness in their therapeutic practices. When I arrived, I had just completed a traditional Akan rites of passage, so I was full of energy as it relates to what it was to be African-centered, and I was instructed by such strong instructors. So I had the use of the drum, and I knew how the drum can alleviate psychological concerns. I knew how to use mythology to some degree, and how to use our oral tradition to alleviate psychological concerns, as well as to push forth values and belief systems, and how to just connect individuals on a more of a African-centered value system, being more holistic than individualistic, being more spiritual than materialistic, and amongst many other things. So when I arrived there, we began to practice it more readily. And then we brought in other strong professionals, and then we moved towards the agenda of really moving towards a African-centered modality. And we begin to connect with our AB-Psi connection, right? Because Dr. Queener and many of the other professionals were members of AB-Psi, American Black Psychology Association, right? And we grew from there. And it's an incredible thing. Let me tell you that. It is a love labor. It is a love labor. We talk about our clients, partnering with our clients, and the relationship that we share with them is a symbiotic one. I don't know if they walked in my office to help me grow, or if they walked in so that I can help them grow.
Could you tell us a little bit about your clients and some of the sorts of things that you do with them, and the outcome of the practice itself?
Yeah. So the practice is a research practice. So we use a number of assessments and pre and post tests as it relates to our clients. We use the SL90 that measures for our clients' range of psychosocial, emotional dispositions, from anxiety, paranoia, delusional thoughts, and etc. And then we put them through the modality, and we test them halfway through, and then we test them at the end. And all of our research shows that it's a tremendously helpful modality in its measurements. And when we talk about more specific issues, I was just speaking to someone today and saying how unique it is to be a culturally based psychology, an African-centered psychology, because school can't prepare you for the things that come into your office. Everything from mediating a young African American male, or two young African American males who are threatening to shoot each other in the community, to some of the more common concerns of dealing with oppression in the workplace, from individuals being sentenced by the court system and being cognitively deficient and not even being able to understand the criminal justice process. It's just a huge range from schizophrenia, from working with adult elders well into their 70s and 80s who want to gain a level of competence in parenting their grandchildren, right? So everything that you can possibly imagine as it relates to what it is to have the African American experiences in there.
You know, and it's interesting because a lot of people, you know, we have audience, you know, throughout the country and a couple of international people, you know, that watch this program, and they're probably thinking a little town like Akron, like, you know, like it's nothing going on. But I remember back in 87, 88, Akron, for lack of a better term, was off the chain. You know, it's a lot of things going on in a city like Akron, you know, violence and crime. So you definitely have your work cut out for you. Now, I want to go off script a little bit because, you know, of course, I want to talk about Sankofa. But when you talked about, you know, realizing you were exploited, I have like a two-part question, because that's an amazing story. I've never heard of anyone like going back, realizing they were exploited and getting the university, you know, to pay for the remainder of education and a master's degree. That's amazing.
Well, this was the NCAA, right? It wasn't the university. It was the NCAA.
NCAA. Yeah. Thanks for that correction.
Mm-hmm.
What ways do you feel that you were exploited? Because I remember at Akron, I'll see the football team. I'm like, man, they got the free tuition. They got the dorm, all the football players in the dorm. Yeah. You know, they the toast of the campus. You know, everybody knows who the football players are, so on and so forth. I know they have the study table. They got tutors. So in what ways, for me, on the outside looking in, I thought it was so great. Educate me. What ways were you guys exploited, do you feel?
Well, very similarly to how they're being exploited now, right? Me being from a very inner city area in Cincinnati, Ohio, Lincoln Heights, all African American community, having not a grand experience in higher education throughout my family experience, and not quite understanding it to the degree that which I could have possibly understood it. I'll tell this story, and I'm a little embarrassed by it, but I can remember after my second year of school, and the athletic counselor came to me and said I had to register for a college, and I told her I already thought I was in college, right?
Right.
And that speaks volume, right? I thought that all I had to do was like high school, go through 4 years of school, and then I was going to come out with some form of college degree. And so it also speaks to my ignorance, and that word, I'm using it in its truest sense, meaning not knowing.
Right.
And the idea of not knowing it and connecting, being a football player to a level of privilege on campus that ignored education but promoted football, right? The idea was school first, football second.
Right.
And that was promoted amongst the athletes for the most part.
And on top of that, when you talk about that exploitation, do you have an opinion about what's going on in the NFL now with Brian Flores? What is he? He has a suit, you know, claiming discrimination as far as coaching, which is, from the outside looking in, it looks like it's true. But do you have an opinion on that at all?
Well, I mean, discrimination in the United States is fundamentally sound.
Right.
And although it's very hard to prove in many instances, right? we know that it exists, and we know that it takes place on a consistent basis. We are not a raceless community or of people in the United States. So I believe it might have some standing to it, and from the details that I've heard, right, in passing, it sounds very sound.
Do you think, and you made a good point, it's hard to prove. How do you see this playing out?
You know, let me say this, it is hard to prove. But in recent years, our judicial system has been taking a closer look outside of all the tangible evidence and looking at some of the subjective interactions that individuals experienced, right? So it wasn't always I needed to know exactly the date and time and what was told to me. It could be a conversation with your therapist about your experience. It could be a soft conversation with one of your colleagues about your experience. And now the judicial system are allowing all of that information to come into play when considering a level of cultural bias or racism.
You talk about athletics and being taken advantage of, for lack of better words. I started off playing at Temple University before I went to Cheney University, so I understand exactly what you're talking about. How does it change things, the scope of things, where these universities are no longer just using their football players or athletes in general with this NIL that's in place? So how does that change things? And is it beneficial or is it non-beneficial for students that are coming from inner cities, may not have much, and now they're coming to these larger programs, and now they can benefit from their likeness? How do you think that changes things on a collegiate sports level?
Well, you know, when I think about when I first recognized that I was exploited as an athlete in the World Football League, I can remember my first year in reaching my incentives to a high degree, and then in my second year of play, I remember not playing as much. And I was talking to one of the trainers, and he explained that, you know, you're not the best. You don't have to be the best to play. And, you know, they'll sit you down because they want to move you away from meeting those incentives, right? And reduce the amount of money that they're gonna pay out. I believe that as it relates to athletes now and being able to receive money on their likeness, it will reduce some of that financial exploitation of those athletes, meaning that if they are a popular image and you're not just going to sit them down because you want to somehow reduce them getting into the professional arena, or maybe not even for punishment under those terms, some of the more minor punishments that college athletes are not allowed to play for. But I believe it's going to be, I think it's going to be a great experience for inner city athletes. I believe that it definitely needs a level of monitoring. The idea of being exposed to generating revenue, even in the World Football League, I wasn't exposed to that much money. We didn't have anyone advising us on money management. I believe that these college athletes are going to need a level of support and supervision as it relates to all of that, all the things that money brings, the challenges that money brings.
Now, could you tell us a little bit, kind of segue here, could you tell us a little bit about the Sankofa program, how it works, and you know, what you do in that program?
Okay, so Sankofa is about cultural resiliency, right? Resiliency, in its general definition, is being able to survive some of life challenges through mental and emotional processes, right? When we look at cultural resiliency, it's really tapping into our instinctual understanding of mental, emotional, behavioral, and spiritual understanding of life processes, and using all of them I refer to it as resiliency as an art, and as an art form to not only help us survive challenges that are currently in our life, but to also insulate us for challenges that are going to come. One of the things that I often say as it relates to resiliency is that our ancestors did more with less, right? They did more with less. And so the question is, how did they do that? They tapped into a set of values and beliefs that the more we become assimilated into the European culture, we begin taking on their values and beliefs. And that leaves us in a position of being less resilient.
Okay. And who do you work with in that program, in the Sankofa?
Well, the Sankofa is a program that I put on with the Akron Public Library, and it's open to the entire community. It's a free program, and it runs parallel to our African-centered modality, right? And so in this particular 4-week seminar, we're talking about we're identifying the definition of resiliency, the definition of being African centered, and individuals are looking at their own personal resiliency skills and the resiliency skills of the community. And we have a set of resiliency tools that we're offering. The idea of being merging our spiritual and material reality, which we really do it instinctually as individuals of African descent. You know, you walk out, you see a flat, you don't just say, "Hey, I got a flat, I need to call someone to fix it." If you really pay attention and become more conscious, you will say something along the lines of, God must not wanted me to be on time today, right? And we immediately merge our spiritual and material reality. And just by making that become more conscious, right? And being more conscious of it, you are insulating yourself from the day-to-day woes that you come in contact with, because there's no use in begrudging fate, right?
Now, Dr. Williams, I know with the 4-part series, you've already done 2 parts.
Yes.
And you've probably just done that with this answer, but could you give us kind of a brief summary of the February 2nd presentation and the one that you did tonight, February 9th?
So on February 2nd, we discussed our spiritual reality, and then we identified tools and things that we can do to enhance our spiritual reality. And we talked about it from a perspective of how we as African people merge our material and spiritual reality. And we also talked about the dominant philosophy being more materialistic, and what it means to be in the strongholds of the dominant philosophy, and the idea that everything material is going to fade, and that through a merger of the spiritual reality, you end up developing a sense of infinity as relates to what it is to be a material symbolic representation of God, right? We are just passing through this material realm, and we don't die, we transition into another understanding. So, and that's all part of our spirituality. We also talked about intrinsic self-worth versus an external sense of self-worth. You know, we live in a country that with social media, although we're more connected, we have a higher sense of loneliness through these increased connections, and our youth are externalizing their sense of self-worth. And it only takes a few quote unquote friends or followers to project an image of them that they don't want to be seen of themselves, and it can unravel their entire personal identity. But when we begin to gain an understanding that we have intrinsic self-worth and intrinsic value, and we're more than the objects that we purchase or the things that we collect, right? We're more than our cars and the clothes we wear, and that we are spiritual beings, and that gives us a sense of intrinsic self-worth, and that reflects back to valuing others as being more important as well, right? The more we learn to love and value ourselves, the more love and value we have to actually give to others as well. So that was on the first day. Today's we discussed the idea of self-knowledge, right? And we also discussed it from a perspective of self-knowledge being the first part of all knowledge and being the quintessential part of all knowledge. You know, that we moved away from that understanding. You know, when we look at the word to educate, and it's etymology, it really means to abstract out of, right? To take out of. We now look at it as this external knowledge that we get from someone else, and as long as we're able to regurgitate it, then we are now educated. But it's really about how you tap into those students' understanding of themselves and are able to pull out their instinctual knowledge of what it is to be themselves. We also discussed, let's see, so that's self-knowledge, intrinsic self-worth, spirituality. I'm sorry, the fourth one, it fails me at this time, but maybe it'll come to me as we continue our discussion.
You know, one thing that really excited me about seeing this, you know, program that you had is that with the school district that I'm with, I joined a team called Healing Centered Engagement. And they talk about the fact that, and I've always said this myself, that we're kind of we're living under a colonial construct, and we're kind of victims of Stockholm syndrome. And Western or European values, we value the individual achievement, you know, so we admire people with a lot of money, you know, but African and Native American culture, which we are part of, celebrates the collective, you know, like, you know, all of us together moving forward as a community. So I think that's one thing that excited me about when I saw this program, because I'm, you know, embarking on something like that too, to work with young people. How do you feel? This is probably an obvious question, but how do you feel this could positively impact young Black males?
Well, you know, right now I'm leading up a project at Minority Behavioral Health regarding African American males. You know, there's a myth that they don't attend therapy. That is not true, right? That is not true. That's far from the truth. Like any other population, they seek help. My caseload is full of them. I have individuals calling every day of that are African American males wanting to participate in the therapeutic process. So, so this program is extremely helpful. One of the areas that we tapped into was the criminal justice system and tapped into reentry. And in tapping into reentry, we were able to assist individuals in coming back into the community and assimilating and navigating their probation and their parole criteria more readily by changing or assisting them and giving consideration to their worldview, I should say, because, you know, there's three functioning worldviews. There's the African-centered worldview, there's the Asiatic worldview, and there's the European worldview. The African-centered worldview is the oldest and one of the predominant, and it also applies to Latinx community as well. And the Asiatic worldview is equally more equivalent to being African-centered than it is European-centered as well. It has a higher level of spirituality connected to it versus the more comprehensive merging of both. And when we look at the European, they are more material in their construct or their worldview. So it has a tremendous effect across all genders, especially African American males,
Now, when you mention African American males and coming into therapy, looking for help in therapy and therapeutic setup, what is the route for young men, let's say prior to, some are coming out in terms of re-entry? What formats are available for young men, let's say in the school system, or those on the street in gang or street organizations, let's say situations? How can programs such as yours reach out to them?
Okay, so Minority Behavioral Health have therapists and case managers that are trained in the African-centered modality in all of Akron public school systems. And we work directly with all of the children and their families. Our motto is that if one individual is sick, then the whole family is sick. So our motto does not limit itself to just that individual, especially when dealing with children. We recognize that children are not able to control their psychological environments. And so it's important that we use a more holistic approach and pull in the parents into that therapeutic idea. And we've been up and running for quite some time now. And so word of mouth is very, very, very popular as it relates to referrals. Individuals can go onto our link, minoritybehavioralhealth.org, and they can complete their request for referral and begin their referral process. My phone rings at least 2 to 3 times a day with individuals inquiring about referrals in the community. It's a very interesting idea. As African people, there's a tremendous number of mental health agencies in Akron, right? But as African people, as white people, they can go to a number one of those agencies. But if individuals of African descent, the research shows that there's a higher success rate in processing through therapy with therapists that hold your same values and belief systems, or that just share a more comprehensive understanding of your life experiences. So that's what we do in Akron. And man, I keep telling you, I want to jump for joy sometime. I can't believe that I'm paid for actually doing this.
Now, let's see, how can I frame this? Is it challenging, or do you find it challenging to get this message out? And here's why I say that. When Doc and Andre and I first started talking about putting this together, I wanted, we all wanted to do something different. We all wanted to do something that focused on the African diaspora, right? I mean, because I see a lot of things, a lot of podcasts, a lot of videos on YouTube. I mean, how many different ways can you talk about Biggie and Tupac? I mean, that still seems to be like, the number one topic. So we wanted to talk about something, African-centered, spiritual, so on and so forth. So when we've had episodes where we talked about what was going on in the Congo, what was going on in Ethiopia, we might get 30 views. I had a good friend of mine that's a comedian that's kind of well known. We had over 1,000 views of that. We had Lords of the Underground on, rap group from the 90s, because I'm friends with them. We had hundreds of views of that. But then when we hit our serious topic, sometimes I'm looking at the views, I'm like, this is all we can get. This is all the love we can get for this one, So do you find it kind of challenging to get this message out, to our people and have them embrace it?
Well, the idea of being African-centered is not a very popular idea across all SES in groups as it relates to African-American community. But there are ways that we can get this idea across. And those ways is just speaking about it from a different perspective, a perspective of the African American experience, right? Individuals may not understand the idea of being more African centered, but when we start talking about the idea of being oppressed and how oppression contributes to a level of emotional discourse, then individuals are more willing to actually come into therapy. Um, Excuse me one moment. I want to ask my wife to and pause for one second.
No problem. No problem.
Yeah, I remember Starks, Virgil Starks.
Yeah, he was a good guy. He was
Yeah.
somebody that students could just, just like you, he was just somebody students could definitely speak.
He was on our team. You know, we had a team. We had a team, the African Faculty and Staff Association.
Yeah, yeah. I remember that.
I did not know
Dr.
that.
Queener was on that too, I think.
Yeah,
John Queener.
Bridgie Ford.
Mm-hmm.
So we pushed around and pushed around. That's how he became assistant dean.
Dean, yes, assistant dean.
Yeah.
That's all right.
Yeah.
Well, go ahead,
So-
Dr. Williams, you were saying.
So I was just saying that, we come in contact with a lot of individuals that are not necessarily well versed in the idea of being African-centered or the African-centered worldview. And we also have to remember that as people of African descent, we were trained to be ashamed of being African or of African descent. And many individuals will tell you right up front, I'm not African, I'm an American, right? I'm a Black American. But we're the only cultural group of people who not only worship a God that don't look like them, but we also practice a worldview that is not our own. So I always tell people, we live here, we act like Europeans, and we're from Africa. Now, how confusing is that, right? And it just speaks volume on some of the conceptual reality understandings that we are challenged with in our day-to-day.
I hear everything.
Okay.
I hear everything you're saying, and what I work in with oral history is one of the biggest things we have is trust, building that bond between you and the narrator that's going to be speaking. We all know that when you hear the word therapy in Blacks, we go, but there's always that those connections where you're crazy, something's wrong with you.
Mm-hmm.
How do you build that bond and that trust to make sure that individuals are getting the help that they need?
Well, so as it relates to being African-centered, we are communal in nature, right? And with that being said, it takes all the personalities to move this globe around. And so we're not over pathologizing individuals. We are not saying because an individual hears voices that they are automatically paranoid schizophrenics, right? We are looking at those symptoms, and we are finding the cultural understanding of those symptoms, and we're developing individual service plans to deal with those symptoms effectively. And by not over pathologizing, not over labeling individuals, by helping individuals gain an understanding that if crazy was a bug, we'll all have crazy COVID, right? Mm-hmm. And that everybody has mental health challenges at some point in time, and that in our traditional belief systems, how we manage these mental health challenges were ingrained into the tapestry of our belief systems. And now we have a different way of tapping into it, and that's through a therapeutic approach. And again, because we don't just work with the individual, we work with the family. I remember when I went to Africa for 4 months, and I had an opportunity to sit with an individual that in the US, he would have been diagnosed as paranoid schizophrenic. And as I sat there with him and saw the way that the priest interfaced with him, it dawned on me that, okay, he might have a level, he might be delusional to some degree, but he's not paranoid, right? And so it was wrapped up into the idea that this individual had a spiritual connection. He wasn't having thoughts of grandeur or et cetera. He was having a spiritual connection. And so the individual never tapped into a level of paranoia, and the individual's family was brought into it as well. And they were able to cope and manage this individual outside of some of the things that we do in the US and the responses that we do to individuals with mental health disorders that are more challenging.
Dr. Holmes, why don't you go ahead and ask the question you were going to ask, and then I want to get into what people can expect that will attend the third and fourth part on February 16th.
Yeah, actually, another question popped up, but I'll go ahead and ask that first question. You mentioned that Pastor Dennis in Akron was interested in having teams of people to do the kind of work you're doing throughout the city. As people come through your process, do they become like part of that team, or how do you interface, with the churches and so forth to build that sort of community team?
So again, individuals come through for internship, and they are trained in the African Center modality. They have opportunities to practice the modality with clients. In many instances, the individuals coming through are working on their PhD in psychology, so they're trained in the biases of testing and assessments, and trained how to look at those assessments from a different perspective. And so what we find, because we are in the school system, is that we are tapping not only to the children, we're tapping into almost all our clients' homes. And that leads us into the more of the church format. Pastor Dennis is a pastor at Mount Calvary Baptist Church here in Akron. He's also a member of a pastors association here in Akron, and individuals such as Pastor Dennis and Roderick Pounds, Pastor Roderick Pounds, they have begin to gain a greater understanding that mental health plays a significant role in our religious belief system. And so they promote it amongst their parishioners. I can remember pouring libations one time, and Pastor Dennis came alongside of me and explained libations from the biblical context. And I just thought it was brilliant that he was able to connect some of the more traditional religious, Christian religious belief systems and the biblical word to our African-centered understanding of libations. And he does that frequently, and so does Pastor Pounds from the pulpit.
Dr. Holmes, you had one more question before we get into
the other question, you talk about assessment, and how do you measure? I know for like school systems and things like that, you have to have some measurements of success. And how is success measured, and what do you find when you do your assessments?
Well, one of our more culturally based assessments is the BSAS, and that is the Belief System Analysis Scale, and that was developed by Linda Jane Myers. This assessment is measuring for areas of intrinsic self-worth, spirituality, communalness, and some other values as well. and individuals take this assessment and they score out. And one of the things we recognize is that most people score in the moderately African-centered range, right? And right in that mid-range. And then when we go back and assess individuals again, we begin to recognize that they're scoring higher than they did when they initially came into services. But one of the things that we also see is we see a level of increased critical analysis and decision making amongst kids, right? We also see a level of cooperative work efforts amongst kids, being able to work alongside of their peers and gain an understanding of the importance of being in the group process and being a part of something that's greater than just the I. And we also see changes in the way parents parent their children, right? And what value systems that they are teaching their children. Many parents don't know, don't even give consideration to what values are coming across as it relates to their parenting skills. Most parents are parenting how they were parented, and by becoming more conscious of your parenting style and more critical of what values and beliefs you want to get across, you start learning new ways of interfacing with your child, and spending more time with your child, recognizing how essential that is. Parents were spending anywhere from up to 6 to 7 hours with their children in the late 90s. Now that is down to approximately 3 to 4 hours a day as it relates to face-to-face time.
And I love when you say that, because someone pointed out to me years ago that in our community, we were big on spanking our children, and that went back to slavery, because, you know, you better whoop your child so they'll be good and not get a real whooping from the slave master.
Right. Protection.
And that went through generations, like you were saying. We parent how we were parented, and we've even bragged about that. You hear Black comedians bragging about, yeah, we beat our kids, so on and so forth. And I'm glad that, you know, most people that I know have gotten away from that, you know, have gotten away from feeling like I have to spank my child, especially my daughter. I don't want to be spanking my daughter, then she grow up thinking it's okay for a man to put his hands on her. You know, daddy loved me, and when he got mad, he spanked me. So, you know, I want my daughter to tell this guy, boy, my daddy didn't even hit me, you know. So you're not going to be, you know, coming with that. So I definitely love that piece where you talk about, you know, taking a look at how we parent, and how, you know, we parent how we were parented. So to close out, why don't you tell the people that are listening and watching what they can expect if they attend the sessions on February 16th and February 23rd? Because when we post this, I'll put a link to the registration in the notes.
So on February 16th, we'll be closing out of our six cultural resilience tools, right? And we'll be covering the holistic worldview and diunital logic. You know, diunital logic is such an interesting idea. Wade Nobles explained that we have a deep structure of culture that we are unconscious of, right? And our logic is part of that deep structure of culture. So instead of having more dichotomized logic, things are this or that, we have this diunital logic that things are both and when we have that both and logic approach, we end up with these creative ideas for resolving some of our life challenges and promoting a level of resiliency that is really insulating. And the holistic worldview is what it is. It is recognizing that we are all interconnected, and that we are also connected to the ancestors. We're connected to each other. We're connected to the children and the unborn, right? And the unborn children as well. And, you know, I think about the idea of having a holistic worldview versus a individualistic worldview. And if we had a more holistic worldview, then we probably wouldn't be destroying the planet, because we'll see ourselves as interconnected to this thing that's moving around. and that we call home.
Okay.
So
And I'm sorry, go ahead, continue.
no, you're fine. You're fine.
Okay.
So, and then on that final day, we're going to begin to discuss the cultural resiliency skills that individuals are going to start using in their personal cultural resiliency plans. And then we're going to also process through cultural resiliency skills that we can take into the community and move into our collective cultural resiliency plan as well. So one of the things that we've come to recognize at Minority Behavioral Health and in my therapeutic practice is that some of us practice our resiliency skills instinctually because they are a big part of what it is to be African American. We're still connected to that diaspora to a very large degree. And so we might have the spiritual understanding down to a science, but we might not have the communal idea down to a science, right? And so individuals are going to pick and choose things to fill the gaps in their plans and come up with their own personal resiliency plan.
And my last question, for those who may attend on the 16th and the 23rd, but they weren't able to attend on February 2nd and 9th, do you think they'll be lost or there'll still be something they can pick up?
I'm giving out the PowerPoint, right?
Okay.
Yeah, so everything will be in there. So you can come at any given time and you're going to get everything that you need as long as you register. You know, as people of African descent, we can't covet information that's going to help us. Right. And that's extremely important to understand. We can't monetize everything. It's important to recognize what's in the greater good of all, right? I was just reading an Egyptian text, and I can't remember the word right now as it relates to greater good, and that the Egyptians came up with Samum Bumadum, I believe. I might be pronouncing it wrong.
If you can get it later, just text it to me and I'll make sure I put it in the notes to this video.
Right. Excellent.
Hey, with Dr. Williams, I definitely want to, thank you for joining us, man. It was a great conversation. Good to see you again after all these years.
Oh, good to see you too, Davey D.
Yeah, we need to have one of those, another one of those Akron U reunions, brother.
Right.
So thanks, and we want to have you on again, brother.
Yeah, good to see you, brother Neil.
Yeah, good seeing you.
It was always a pleasure to know you was at the university, right? Yeah, it was always a pleasure. And Brother Taylor, man, I hope we get a chance to link up and talk a little bit more about your area of expertise. That sounds extremely interesting. I immediately went to the idea of coding, right? And how we have to code as individuals of African descent.
Yeah,
definitely.
So, yeah.
Well, I'll make that connection between you two.
Excellent.
All right, thanks again, brother.
Thank you all. Have a great evening.
You too.
Lord, yes, papi, hit me one time and make it funky.
I was brought up and taught to have no fear.